Neozoic Island. Written by David Overholt. Produced by OBRO Studio.
If you're hearing this recording, it means that I am dead. My name is George Walter Holland, and I'm making this statement so there can be a complete audio record of how I created this island and the wondrous creatures who live here. I suppose it all began for me when I was 4 years old and my father took me to the Museum of Natural History. I still remember the first time I saw the giant towering bones of Tyrannosaurus, Brachiosaurus, and Triceratops, and how those magnificent animals captured my imagination. But for me it was more than just a passing childhood fancy. It became an obsession that would shape the course of the rest of my life. As a young man, I made my fortune with oil, fossil fuels. So once again the dinosaurs had taken a hand in shaping my destiny. Later on in life, I became fascinated with the concept of cryptozoology. Hearing tales of Mokele Mbembe, a long-necked sauropod supposedly living in the jungles of the Congo, or the Kongomoto, a flying pterosaur. I went on numerous expeditions over the course of my life looking for these creatures all over the world, but I never found them. Despite this, my love for these amazing creatures never diminished, and so, quite against the advice of my lawyers and banker, I founded the G.W. Holland Foundation and funded countless paleontological digs all over the world. I built museums and filled them with the bones of dinosaurs for the world to enjoy. But then I heard that soft tissue, including blood vessels, had been found inside the bones of Tyrannosaurus, and my heart fluttered, like I was a small boy once again. For years, scientists had said that if they had DNA of dinosaurs, they could clone them and bring them back from extinction. I spent over $500 million collecting samples from every species I could, until I found that their claims were hollow. The empty promises of over-enthusiastic scientists that thought this sort of biological material would never be found. Bringing back the dinosaurs was an impossible dream, I could see that now. But then my mind turned to another solution. If there was no way to bring dinosaurs back from extinction, to relive the Mesozoic age, perhaps instead I could create a Neozoic age, with new creatures the world had never seen before, that captured the same grandeur of dinosaurs, the same wonder and mystery. And so we set about our work. It was slow going at first, until we read papers on a process known as Atavism Activation, taking dormant genes inside living creatures, interrupting their natural development and turning these genes back on again. The earliest tests were with chickens in a laboratory, experimenting to see if we could give them teeth and claws and other reptilian features. There were, of course, critics. There are always critics, calling it unnatural, unethical, reciting the old adage that there are some things that man was never meant to tamper with. But even they couldn't deny the exciting implications of what we were doing, or the sense of wonder when they saw that it worked. As the embryos developed, we saw beaks begin to round to reptilian snouts. Teeth formed. Wings became arms with claws and hands. And for the first time, we truly felt as if the curtains of eons had rolled back, and we were witnessing the birth of a creature from some bygone age. A lost world, if you like. There were, of course, certain complications to overcome. We never could get the chickens to grow long tails naturally, as they weren't part of their original biological makeup, and in the end we had to resort to further genetic manipulation to get them there. It was only a temporary setback, of course, thanks to another process known as Transgenesis, where features from one species can be transferred to another through genetic manipulation. And in this case we used monitor lizards and artificially grafted their genes into the chickens so they could grow long reptilian tails. We used this process again and again for all the other creatures on the island. After the initial excitement had worn down in the lab, we soon realized there were complications. The animals were sterile, and for a time it looked as though my Neozoic world would be nothing more than an unfulfilled childish dream. Even after we solved the breeding problem, they weren't passing their genetic modifications on to the next generation, and often the parents would devour their young, seeing their unmodified chicks as nothing more than a food source. But then, on May 25th, during a violent tropical storm that raged across the island, it happened. As the eggs hatched, we collectively held our breath, and then we saw it. A small reptilian creature breaking free from its shell. And as the thunder rolled and the rain splashed down on the tin metal roof of the laboratory, we witnessed the birth of a new species, Primisaurus, because it was the first. We wondered if Primisaurus would still scratch and peck at the ground looking for worms despite their new outward appearance. But we quickly discovered that the new predatory traits gave rise to the corresponding behaviors, and it was a costly lesson. An unforeseen side effect of our genetic tampering with the chickens, combining them with the monitor lizard DNA, was that Primisaurus was venomous. We only learned this after one of the keepers was badly bitten. If you've ever been around a rooster defending its hens, you know how aggressive they can be. It leapt at her face, clawing and scratching. It let out a strange noise somewhere between a hiss and a crow. I'll never forget that sound, combined with her shrieks and calls for help. She had severe lacerations all over her arms and chest. Its talons gripped into her rib cage as it perched itself on her side before it bit deeply into her neck. It took 2 full-grown men to pry it off of her in the end. To make matters worse, the keeper was violently allergic to the venom. She was 23 years old, 5'4", about 130 pounds. The venom was ravaging her system. Our medical staff put her on a strict regimen of antivenom as soon as we possibly could. She nearly died. I'll never forget how it looked, standing there defiantly, with a mixture of its venomous saliva and her blood dripping from its snout. After that, we put new security protocols in place. We thought we'd taken every precaution, but in those few horrifying moments we quickly learned just how dangerous these animals could be. If the naysayers and bureaucrats had had their way, our research would have never gotten off the ground. Due to certain laws, experimentation with Atavism Activation had previously never been carried to their conclusion. The embryos had to be destroyed before they hatched. To circumvent this, we set up shop in a retrofitted oil tanker, which became a sort of mobile laboratory that we sailed in international waters while I searched for a suitable island that I could purchase and fill with the fruits of our labours. After finding a location that suited our needs, construction began on our research centre almost immediately. It was a state-of-the-art facility, surrounded by concrete walls and a network of electrified fences for security. We had living quarters for the researchers, and the facility itself was one half genetics laboratory and one half zoo, complete with enclosures so we could breed the animals and eventually release them onto the island. Construction took 12 months and the cost was enormous. Aside from the specialized laboratory equipment, we had to have special enclosures, feeding and handling equipment so the animals wouldn't become domesticated, our own water purification plant, and a host of other utilities. The entire compound was run on a mixture of solar power and a network of small generators. While construction was still underway, I regularly took trips by helicopter to our mobile laboratory in the oil tanker that was anchored a few miles offshore. I'll never forget the day I was making one of my bi-weekly inspections of the laboratory. A violent storm arose on the sea. Here we were in our lab, trying to control the very building blocks of life, and I felt as though nature itself was fighting back. The ship nearly sank and we almost lost everything, but fortunately the facility was completed shortly after, and we began moving all of our equipment and precious genetic samples ashore. I still remember when I first stepped foot on the island, I was taken back by its natural beauty. Miles and miles of tropical rainforest, completely untouched by human hands, leading to the summit of a dormant volcano. The perfect place for dinosaurs, I thought. Even the waves pounding on the shore seemed to roar like the distant echo of creatures from another age. The rich volcanic soil was perfect for our needs. We imported mangroves, flowering plants, fruit trees, and other vegetation from various ecosystems based on the dietary and environmental needs of the animals we were about to introduce, and the ones we were about to create. The island already had its fair share of birds, frogs, lizards, and snakes, but we also introduced several other non-native species to make the island unlike any other place on the planet. Armadillos and pangolins became sort of miniature stand-ins for ankylosaurs, while giant Galapagos tortoises and Alligator snapping turtles added to the ancient feel of the ecosystem. Earless monitors, frilled lizards, capybaras, and countless other small mammals and tropical birds brought new life to the jungles. We allowed the new plants and animal life to overrun the island before we eventually introduced the predators that we would create. And for a moment, when I thought of the ramifications of what we were about to attempt, admittedly I felt a slight sense of hesitation. After all, this was paradise. I was about to introduce the serpents. With the success of Primisaurus, we decided it was time to move forward with larger and more impressive specimens. After all, if the process worked on chickens, it would surely work on other birds as well. It's a strange feeling looking back to when there were only 4 species on the island. We'd only just begun our work, and after the initial hardships were overcome, it was an exciting time for everyone. We imported 3 new species of terrestrial bird for genetic modification, and along with Primisaurus they formed the cornerstone of the island's population. The first of these new birds we decided to import was the red-legged Sariema from South America. Brazilian farmers often use them to guard their chickens, despite the fact that they're only 35 inches long and weigh just over 4 pounds. The reason I knew I had to have this creature on the island was its signature sickle-shaped claw. The Sariema's feet look exactly like those of Velociraptor, which is why we named the creature Affinoraptor after we were finished with our genetic modifications. We increased its overall size by nearly 3 times, and like Primisaurus, we employed a mixture of Atavism Activation, as well as combining the Sariema bird with the golden tiger lizard from South America. This gave Affinoraptor its signature tiger stripe markings and a more robust skeleton. To create a sort of makeshift Gallimimus, we imported ostriches from the Horn of Africa. The largest living birds in the world, males can grow up to 9 feet tall and weigh more than 330 pounds. They can run at speeds up to 45 miles an hour and can deliver enough power in a single kick to kill a lion. We called them Struthiosaurus, and seeing a large group of them running through a jungle clearing in the early morning light is quite a sight to behold. Years ago, when I first caught wind of the process known as Atavism Activation, the bird I longed to try this experimental procedure on the most was the northern cassowary, the most dangerous bird in the world, found in the tropical rainforests of New Guinea and Australia. From their signature head crest to their large claws on their feet, the northern cassowary already possessed a primal and ancient appearance, and I knew if the procedure worked, with the proper genetic modifications, they would be flawless. As pleased as I was with the success of Primisaurus or Affinoraptor, our genetically modified cassowaries were a masterpiece. We called them Chickenosaurus. They were terrifying, deadly, and beautiful. Everything I had always imagined dinosaurs to be. The first time I saw it, with the dappled light of the forest glistening on its scales, moving silently along the jungle floor, stalking its prey, I felt as though all of my wildest boyhood dreams about the prehistoric age materialized out of the fog and were given flesh. We could have stopped there, but I knew in my heart that this was only the beginning, and there was more work be done. Atavism Activation worked well enough on birds to create our own various forms of theropod, but the process of creating our own facsimiles of Brachiosaurus or Triceratops required much more extensive and complicated genetic manipulation. In 1974, virologist Rudolf Janich performed the first recorded genetic modification at Salk Institute, experimenting with mice. Around the same time, Beatrice Mintz, a mouse embryologist, was conducting her own genome alterations at the Fox Chase Cancer Center. Their early work proved the feasibility of the process, and they laid the foundations for genetic modification and research for years to come. In 1987, D.W. Salter and L.B. Crichton modified the DNA of chickens in an effort to cure rare illnesses in poultry birds. Transgenic farm animals are engineered to have better resistance to disease, increased size, and to produce better byproducts such as high-quality milk. Building on their research, we created some of the more unique animals on the island through a process of complex gene editing, based on a technology known as CRISPR-Cas9, which allows genetic researchers to customize any living organism's genetic sequence by making highly specific changes to their DNA. We started out small, of course, but the potential of this more advanced gene editing became apparent very quickly. As a small boy, the Dimetrodon always captured my imagination, and so we set about to create our own, a sort of scientific gumbo, taking the bits from various animals that we liked and combining them together into our own creature, which we aptly named Zygosaurus, or sailed lizard. We used the body of a Komodo dragon and mixed in the skull shape of a moray eel to give it a more accurate representation of the Dimetrodon. For the sail, we used the dorsal fin of a sailfish, and with a little extra manipulation we increased the animal's overall size. After that, our genetic combinations became more ambitious. We combined the great blue heron with a flying fox to give it large leathery wings like a pterodactyl. We called them Chiroptosaurs. To make them look more like pterosaurs, we gave them the distinctive head crest of a plumed basilisk lizard. An unintended side effect of this genetic union was the fact that the creature was completely omnivorous, with a shared instinct to hunt for fish and to eat fruit. When they soared overhead, high above the jungle canopy, where you saw them gliding over the crystal surface of a lake at dawn, you felt as though you were in another world. There were countless tropical birds all over the island, of course, but they were the true lords of the air. Admittedly, it felt a bit like mad science, but now I can understand why Dr. Frankenstein couldn't help himself. It was all too exciting. To build a healthy population on the island, we instituted a sort of captive breeding program used by zoos since the 1970s to reintroduce endangered species back into their natural habitat. The cost was enormous, of course. In order to maintain the program, I spent more than $200,000 a year for every single species. I had hired the top minds in species survival planning and conservation programs, but establishing self-sufficient populations was a nightmare. We lost entire groups, in fact, due to illness or failed introduction when we released them from a compound into the interior of the island. I lost count how many times we had to start over from scratch. Back to formula, as they say. The California condor was critically endangered, all but extinct. But they became one of the greatest success stories of captive breeding, being successfully reintroduced into the wild in 1991. So I knew it was possible. This was just another setback, and I wasn't about to give up now. Not when we were so close to achieving my dream. And eventually, our creations took hold. But even then we had problems with genetic diversity among the various animal groups. In the end we created 10 mated pairs per species to ensure they would thrive. Somehow a small group of eco-terrorists got wind of what we were doing and made their way to the island. Their leader carried a manifesto with them decrying our brutality. They didn't approve of our animal research. They started fires in 2 of the laboratories before they were caught. 2 years of research and development up in smoke. We still don't know how they got to the island, and 3 of our research technicians were badly burned in the fire. We had to medevac them by helicopter back to the mainland for treatment. After we caught the saboteurs, my game warden, Nigel Parker, jokingly said we should feed them to the Chickenosaurs. His statements were strangely prophetic. The eco-terrorists were resourceful enough to escape from the security hut. We warned them not to leave the compound because it was getting dark. They didn't listen. They were trying to get to one of the boats at the loading dock on the other side of the island. I sent Parker and a heavily armed search party to find them. But the sun was setting and we had to recall the team and lock down the compound for the night. The following morning, our search team set out at first light. After all, the saboteurs were still human beings. But in my heart, I knew what they would find. I was just waiting for the call. Cassowaries are the most dangerous birds in the world, native to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia and Australia. They weigh upwards of 157 pounds and stand 6 feet tall with 5-inch dagger-like claws on the inner toes of each foot. When they attack, they leap at their victims and kick downward with the full force of their weight behind their attack. They can split a full-grown man wide open from his collarbone down to his hips. Genetically modified cassowaries combined with the monitor lizard DNA made Chickenosaurus a very dangerous and deadly animal, one of the most deadly animals on the island. I heard the radio crackle and my stomach twisted in knots for a moment before I answered. Parker found the saboteurs. From the tracks it was clear they had in fact run into Chickenosaurus. They had been disemboweled and partially eaten. Parker and his team chased away a small group of Primisaurus that were picking up the pieces that were left. I'd never felt more alone as I sat there in my office, wondering what to do next, when I received a call from the helicopter. Our research technicians had died on their way to the hospital. In the end, 6 people lost their lives. 3 researchers, 3 saboteurs. When Parker heard our technicians had died from the fire, He saw the other deaths in the jungle as a sort of justice, a life for a life, nature balancing the scales. And so he wrote it up as a laboratory accident. And no official report of the saboteurs was ever made. After I notified the families, I paid for all the funeral expenses and set up trust funds for each of them so they would be well cared for. I knew it wouldn't bring their loved ones back, but it was all I could do for them. After the funerals, we hardly spoke of what happened. We collectively threw ourselves back into our work, creating new life to try and move on from those we lost. The biotechnologies behind the creation of all the animals on this island required years of intensive research and development. Genetically modified or transgenic organisms are altered through recombinant DNA by either combining DNA from different genomes or inserting foreign DNA into a genome. While recombinant DNA technology found its footing in the 1960s and 70s, the general principle was discovered years earlier by an English medical officer named Frederick Griffith, who was studying the bacteria responsible for a pneumonia epidemic in London in 1928. Years later, American biologist Martin Gilbert and his colleagues from the National Institute of Health discovered what they called DNA joining enzymes that glue short strands of DNA together during replication. Eventually, this groundbreaking discovery led to experiments recombining DNA from individuals from different species. As amazing as this technology was, for a time it seemed that successfully combining reptilian, mammalian, and avian DNA into a single creature was a hopeless endeavor. But then, on May 7th, 2008, a scientific paper was published by the Washington University School of Medicine, where Richard K. Wilson, PhD, director of the Genome Center at Washington University, and an international consortium of scientists had successfully mapped the genome of the platypus. Their research showed how this amazing animal possessed the traits of birds, mammals, and reptiles, and by analyzing its genome, we were finally able to discover how this peculiar mixture of features was possible. After that, the real magic began. All the limits were gone, and we were free to create anything we liked. The Triceratops was always one of my favorite dinosaurs, and so to build our own we mixed an Indian rhinoceros with both Jacksons and veiled chameleons in order to give it 3 horns and a head crest. For its beak we used alligator snapping turtle DNA, and while it provided a more robust tail, unfortunately, it also added to the creature's aggressive tendencies. We call them Tricornusaurus, and like the rhinoceros, they have very poor eyesight, so they're easily startled and will charge at anything unfamiliar they see as a threat. When they're full grown, they can weigh over 3 tons, and along with Audiosaurus, they represent the megafauna of the island. Whenever we release a new animal into the ecosystem, we study them for the first few months to make sure it is properly integrating into its new environment. We introduced a young female of the researchers named Sarah to increase the biodiversity of the Tricornusaur population. It was all going well at first. She was adjusting to her new surroundings, and she had even attracted the attention of the bulls. One in particular, a large and highly aggressive male they called Duo, because one of his horns had broken off during combat. On a standard research expedition to gather blood samples and monitor Sarah's health, the team noticed a change in her behavior. And then they heard a low rumbling bellow coming from the tree line, followed by rustling leaves and snapping twigs. And suddenly, A large male with a broken horn burst into the field, frothing at the mouth in full rut. He was covered in cuts and gashes after defending his territory from other males that were interested in the young female. When he saw the researcher's jeep, he mistook it for a rival and flew into a territorial rage. He began stamping the ground, digging up large furrows of earth and throwing them high into the air. There was no time for the researchers to return to their vehicle and drive back to the safety of the compound. So they did the only thing they could. They stood absolutely still and hoped he would see them as part of the jungle and charge the jeep instead of them. You see, the Indian rhinoceros can run at 34 miles an hour, and the added predatory nature of the alligator snapping turtle made Tricornusaur a very dangerous and violent animal, with a bite force strong enough to snap a human femur in two. Seeing how effortlessly it toppled the jeep when it charged brought home just how powerful these animals really were, and how weak we were by comparison without our technology to help us. Mike Wolf, the research team's video documentarian, managed to keep his head and capture the entire ordeal on camera. In the end, we had to send in a helicopter to scare off the big male and retrieve our research team. Fortunately, no one was injured, but it was certainly an expedition we would all remember for the rest of our lives. To create our own hadrosaurs or duck-billed dinosaurs, we combined ducks, specifically the northern shoveler, kangaroos, and the common brown basilisk. The basilisk gave it the scales, coloration, head crest, and ridge along the back, which completed the animal's prehistoric appearance. We increased their size so they would stand 6 feet tall at the hip, and when they stand completely upright to observe their surroundings, they're quite a sight to behold. They are social animals, gathering at shallow marshes and lagoons all over the island, where they use their large bills and comb-like teeth to sift for small organisms and seeds in the mud. They also forage on land like kangaroos. Like the platypus, they lay eggs, but the mothers also produce milk for their young after they've hatched. It's a fascinating combination of features. We named them Anatisaurus, and while they have a docile appearance, we still give them a healthy amount of respect. Kangaroos instinctively seek out water when they are evading predators, and if a dingo or monitor lizard is foolish enough to follow in after them, they grab them by the neck and hold them under the surface of the water until they drown. Because of this, no keepers are allowed in the water with Anatisaurus, to avoid any unfortunate accidents. We learned our lesson with Primisaurus. I was there when we designed them, of course, but I can't deny that the first time I saw a large family group of them appearing out of the mist, rising up out of the water to take their first steps onto the muddy bank, I was left in a state of wonder. The sun was just beginning to rise. The morning calls of various jungle birds and animals were hanging in the air. And while these herbivores were not the sharp-toothed carnivorous dinosaurs that captured my imagination as a small boy, seeing them here, alive, dipping beneath the surface of the water and coming up again, they had a sort of quiet nobility about them, and I was beginning to change how I felt about this island. They belonged here, and this was their world. I've never been one for superstition or premonitions of the future, but from the time I awoke that day, I couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. We all felt it, a sense of unease hung thick in the air, like the charge you feel when a storm is coming. We tried to put it aside and go about our work, but deep down we all knew something was wrong, or that it was about to be. It was the end of May, and the heat was incredible. When you stepped outside, the air hit you all at once, like the heat from a blast furnace. Tempers were short, and tensions grew with every passing hour. Even the animals were becoming agitated. It was feeding time, and that's when it happened. One of the keepers was overcome by the heat, but not before he unlocked the main paddock doors of the second largest predator on the island. Maxillosaurus. You see, it derived its name from its long and powerful jaws. Maxillosaurus was to be our Baryonyx or Spinosaurus, and naturally the crocodile was one of the main ingredients for creating this animal. There are over 14 species of crocodile all over the world, with habitats ranging from freshwater rivers and lakes to saltwater estuaries, lagoons or mangrove swamps. They can grow over 25 feet in length and weigh upwards of 2,600 pounds. But we bred Maxillosaurus to be much bigger. Like crocodiles, Maxillosaurus is semi-aquatic, a natural ambush predator, and the young male that we were about to release had grown accustomed to the feeding schedule. He knew the sound of the large paddock doors being unlocked meant food was close at hand. He'd been growing steadily more and more aggressive over the past 3 weeks, and when the keeper was overcome by the heat, he saw his opportunity to strike. He burst through the paddock gate with astonishing speed, overturning the large metal feeding cart filled with sides of beef. The code red alarm sounded, and we dispatched the emergency weapons team immediately, but it was too late for the keeper. There was nothing we could do except helplessly watch from the control center as he was eaten. He was dead after the first bite. A crocodile's jaws can apply 5,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, the strongest bite of any animal in the world, 10 times more powerful than that of the great white shark. The only comfort was that he was already unconscious from the heat, so he never felt it. Our security chief Clayton Marshall successfully evacuated the area, escorting the other keepers and technicians to secure locations all over the compound, while special firearms teams and animal management staff led by head animal wrangler James Irwin sealed off the area to neutralize the threat. But not before Maxillosaurus had broken into the paddocks of some of our herbivores, attacking a juvenile Argiosaurus, one of our sauropod-like creatures. And what we can only assume was a burst of territorial rage or overstimulation of its natural predatory instincts, he clamped down on the juvenile Argiosaurus neck and severed its head completely, before turning his attention to a group of Struthiosaurus, and finally a baby Tricornusaur. After that, he made his way back to the main causeway and began exploring the rest of the compound as the emergency weapons team closed in around him. I remember standing there in the dimly lit control room, all of us huddled around computer monitors watching the live feeds of the security cameras from the main courtyard. After all the damage Maxillosaurus had caused, it only had a short way to go before it reached the main doors and escaped into the island. But suddenly, in the middle of its violent rampage, it stopped. You see, when we first constructed the compound, I insisted on the creation of a life-size bronze statue of a Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton for the main entryway, to sort of inspire our team of geneticists and technicians in what we were creating here. And this was the first time Maxillosaurus had ever seen the form of another large predator. He stood there, bellowing at this ghostly giant from the past. The winds began to blow violently, and the sky darkened as storm clouds rolled in. As our emergency team huddled under the awning to protect themselves from the oncoming storm, lightning struck the bronze statue. Thunder split the air, almost as if Tyrannosaurus was roaring from the past, asserting its dominance over this pretender. Bronze is a better conductor of heat and electricity than most steel, and the lightning bolt that struck the statue arced into Maxillosaurus. And as the rain began to fall, I couldn't deny the irony that here was our most fearsome creation to date, lying dead at the feet of Tyrannosaurus. Because despite our best efforts to recreate the power and majesty of the dinosaurs, even in death, Tyrannosaurus was still king. No prehistoric ecosystem will be complete without the towering giants, the long-necked sauropod dinosaurs like Brachiosaurus. And by far the largest and most unique of our creations was our own facsimile of a sauropod, which we named Arduosaurus. Our genetic editing was highly advanced at this stage, and it was one of the most complex creatures that we ever attempted. Creating a viable animal that shared the traits of elephants and giraffes and merged them with reptilian features presented a host of challenges. But in the end it was one of the most awe-inspiring creatures I'd ever seen. Since Arduosaurus was an herbivore, we knew it didn't need to camouflage itself for stalking prey, and it was much too large to hide in the jungle. So we decided to give it a striking appearance. The reptilian DNA we introduced came from the black spiny-tailed iguana, native to Mexico and Central America. They were chosen for their distinctive black and white banded coloration, as well as the row of comb-like spines that ran along the neck, back and tail. This, combined with their massive size, cast them in sharp relief to their jungle surroundings and made them one of the most magnificent and awe-inspiring creatures on the island. The giraffe is the tallest naturally occurring terrestrial animal on the planet. Their neck alone is 7 feet in length. Each cervical vertebrae is over 11 inches long. The largest recorded giraffe was 19 feet tall. The males are much larger than the females and engage in territorial disputes, swinging their long necks like clubs to attack their rivals. This behavioral trait was passed on to Arduosaurus, and thanks to their reptilian DNA, they also lash each other with their tails, which are the size of small trees. The sounds of their combat echoing through the jungle is incredible, and one can only imagine what it must have been like to witness a battle between the ancient giants of the past, like Brachiosaurs or Dreadnoughtosaurus, dueling for supremacy in a prehistoric world. We often think of dinosaurs thundering along, shaking the ground with their footsteps. But like the African forest elephant, Arduosaurus moves silently through the jungle, quieter than most humans in fact, due to their soft padded feet. African forest elephants are native to Central Africa, in the lush tropical rainforests in Cameroon and the Congo Basin, as well as in the Ivory Coast and Ghana in West Africa. I remember these stealthy giants from an early expedition in the Congo searching for Mbembe, and I thought it was only fitting that the animal I mistook for a long-necked sauropod late one evening would serve as the genetic basis for our facsimile of Brachiosaurus. Like the African forest elephant, Ardiosaurus seek out mineral-rich watering holes in jungle clearings. The volcanic rock offers salt and other vital minerals needed to neutralize toxins in the rainforest leaves and tree bark that make up a majority of their diet, along with various other fruits, seeds, and vegetation. They stand well over 10 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh in at over 15,000 pounds. They live in family groups of about 20 and roam freely across the entire island. And with genetic modifications we were able to increase their size to just over 22 feet tall, making them the tallest animals in the world. Any larger and we wouldn't have been able to sustain a healthy population on the island. They represented the megafauna of the island, and I knew in order to keep this delicate ecosystem in balance, we needed a predator capable of keeping their population in check. And while Maxillosaurus was undeniably a powerful animal, I knew I needed something larger, something primal, a crowning achievement that could rule this island. As rewarding as our success had been, I must confess that over the years we had experienced our fair share of loss. Many of our friends and colleagues had unfortunately lost their lives making this dream a reality, and for a time I began questioning if the cost was too high. We had faced many challenges over the years, from hurricanes to power failure, even saboteurs, and I must confess I grew weary of the constant struggle, the setbacks, and the loss of life, which was weighing on me heavily. It seemed every success was tinged with tragedy, but I realized what began as my dream had become a shared goal for everyone on this island. We'd come too far to stop now, and despite all the hardships and setbacks, we all wanted to see these creatures live and thrive. And I remembered that success is a culmination of countless unseen failures, and while that began to lift my spirits, there was always this nagging thought in the back of my mind, wondering what else could possibly go wrong, and nature, it seemed, had an answer standing by. It was the middle of the dry season, and to make matters worse, the dormant volcano at the center of the island was beginning to awaken, rumbling back to life after more than 100 years. The buildup of various gases and geothermal energy began causing small tremors all across the island. Those were the first warning signs before the mountain came thundering back to life. It was only a small eruption, but the pyroclastic flow ignited a forest fire that burned up nearly 30% of the island before we got the fires under control. One of the most iconic and prevailing images of the dinosaur age is that of volcanic eruptions as dinosaurs are overcome by lava. The irony was not lost upon me that here my creations were meeting a similar fate. But I wouldn't be beaten by nature. I wouldn't let everything I'd built over these years be destroyed, or the sacrifices of my friends and colleagues be in vain. And eventually the volcano settled, and nature rebalanced. The storm had passed, and like a phoenix rising from the ashes, life began anew and reclaimed the scorched earth. Our greatest concern was for the animals, but as the smoke cleared we saw that our creatures had survived, and more than that, they thrived as new life blossomed all around them. Witnessing these magnificent creatures survive the most violent forces of nature, I felt a sense of pride, and I knew they would stand the test of time. That is, if they could survive what we were about to unleash. Something akin to Tyrannosaurus Rex was what I had hoped to achieve, and I would settle for nothing less. The undisputed king of this primal ecosystem, this Neozoic Island. But while trying to create the island's apex predator, we inadvertently gave birth to a creature that very nearly caused an extinction level event. And when I saw the damage that it caused, I wondered if we'd finally gone too far. Tyrannosaurus Rex was the most dangerous and lethal predator the world has ever known. 40 feet long, 12 feet tall at the hip, with an average adult weight of between 15 to 23,000 pounds. According to a study conducted at the University of Missouri, led by Ian Coast, PhD, the Tyrannosaur's unique skull combined with its bone-crushing bite force delivered up to 6 tons of pressure, enough to crush a car. And in hindsight, I suppose it should have given me pause that something on par with this fearsome animal is what we were attempting to create. But like most small boys, Tyrannosaurus was not only the king of the dinosaurs, he was king of my imagination. I used to dream for hours on end, admittedly when I should have been paying more attention to my studies, how they must have lived, how they hunted and ate. I often wished I could pull back the curtain of time and see them with my own eyes, to see something mythical that was also real. As the years went by and I grew older, this sense of wonder for dinosaurs left my friends, but it never left me. I still wanted to see, and so the long and arduous process of creating our answer to Tyrannosaurus Rex began. Named after the ancient monster from Greek mythology due to its combination of animal traits, the Chimerasaurus will be everything I ever imagined dinosaurs to be. A culmination of my greatest dreams and fears in one beautiful, terrible beast. According to myth, ancient Lycia was rescued from a rampaging chimera by the hero Bellerophon, riding aboard his winged Pegasus. But sadly, we wouldn't be so fortunate. There was no great hero of legend to save us from the monster we were about to create. Unlike the rest of the creatures on this island, who were heavily modified from living animals, we built Chimerasaurus from the ground up, combining the most extreme predatory traits from various animals with one small sample of biological material we had recovered from a tyrannosaur femur years ago. Highly fragmentary, of course, but this incomplete sample was our secret sauce, as the boys in the lab called it, that helped bring us one step closer to what we were trying to accomplish. Using machine learning and artificial intelligence, our technicians developed a software that could extrapolate how Chimerasaurus would look based on the genetic information we input into the program, meaning from its skeletal and muscular structure to the integument of its skin, we could design every aspect of this creature's appearance from head to tail, down to the color of its scales. To achieve its size, we overstimulated the pituitary gland, creating a sort of controlled gigantism. Even some of the technicians questioned the wisdom of what we were doing. We only bred the largest and strongest pairs, and the results were more than I could have hoped for. The first time I saw it materialize, fully grown out of the shadows of the jungle canopy, I found myself suddenly overtaken with a primal fear that I'd never felt before in my life. And I knew I was no longer in control of this island. This Neozoic ecosystem that I had created now had a king, a fearsome apex predator, the Chimerasaurus Rex. Looking back, I wonder where we went wrong. If there were any warning signs I ignored in my quest to bring back the power and majesty of the dinosaurs. I've mulled over the question again and again, and I have yet to find an answer. The jungle is a dangerous and unforgiving place. I learned that much in my years in Africa. And it was painfully true here as well. One mistake can be deadly, and when you're dealing with complex genetic manipulation, mistakes are an unfortunate and unavoidable reality. Such is the nature of science that pushing the boundaries of knowledge and discovery often comes at a terrible cost. And the price we paid for creating Chimerasaurus was nearly more than I could bear. A unique problem we faced with this creature was that since it was a custom-designed, completely man-made organism, unlike the other animals on the island, we had no way of predicting its natural baseline behavior. So we set up a research team to monitor and study their hunting and feeding habits after we released them from their temporary enclosures. It was always an exciting and stressful time seeing how our latest creations would fare in the wild. Since it was designed as the apex predator of the island, we knew Chimerasaurus had to be a powerful animal, so we engineered it with a special mutation of the myostatin gene like the Belgian Blue, a large heavily muscled breed of cattle that originated in central and upper Belgium in the 19th century. Myostatin is a protein that inhibits muscular development, and by artificially shortening the myostatin gene, this mutation results in accelerated muscle growth, causing the animal to be born with twice the usual number of muscle fibers. Hypoplasia is called. The mutation also requires an extremely high protein diet to compensate for the increase in muscle mass. We designed the animal this way to ensure the necessary levels of predation to keep the population of our large herbivores in check. For the sake of biodiversity, we initially released 6 specimens, but in a matter of weeks, the largest and most aggressive male had killed his rivals, along with the females they were pair bonded with. His own mate began avoiding him soon after. At the time, we thought the big male was marking his territorial boundaries. After all, a certain amount of killing is expected when you release a predator into a new environment. Surplus killing, also known as henhouse syndrome, is a common behavior exhibited among predators, where during these overkill events they display abnormal levels of aggression, killing more prey than they can eat. A leopard in Cape Province, South Africa, killed 51 sheep in a single incident. Normally this killing frenzy subsides and the animal returns to its natural behavior patterns. But with the large male, his terrible rage only intensified as the killings continued. And I came to the sickening realization that, like Dr. Frankenstein, we had created a monster that was beyond our control. Every day the researchers were finding the uneaten bodies of animals they had cared for and studied for years. And for a time we couldn't understand why the smaller predators and scavengers like Primisaurus hadn't picked the carcasses clean. Until we realized they were too afraid. They had scattered to other parts of the island, well outside their normal territory. And then early one morning I received a radio call from Nigel Parker, my game warden. The bloated corpses of an entire family group of duck-billed Anatisaurus had been found, floating in the lagoon. From there, things only got worse. I had seen acts of violence and predation among animals before during my trips to Africa and India. Even here on the island, I knew how savage nature could be. But when the live feeds from the helicopter came back, and I saw the carnage and devastation, my blood ran cold. This was not simple predation. This was something else, something brutal. And I knew if we didn't stem the slaughter soon, there would be nothing left on this island. There was something wrong with this animal. It had to be destroyed, that much was clear. So I ordered my game warden Nigel Parker to form a hunting party. A decision that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Because if I had known what was about to happen, I never would have sent them into the jungle that day. Before we released the big male from his enclosure, Alejandro Peña, one of the keepers, had nicknamed him Diablo due to his reddish coloration and temperament. A fitting name, as it turned out, because, like the devil himself, he was cunning and deceitful, with a vicious streak unlike any animal I had ever seen before. The hunting party we formed to deal with Diablo was a joint operation between Nigel Parker and his most experienced trackers and my security chief Clayton Marshall and his animal control fire teams that dealt with rogue animals that escaped from their enclosures. We outfit the team with the best equipment money could buy: state-of-the-art GPS tracking units, high-powered rifles, radios and body cams that sent live feeds back to 12 monitors for real-time communications back at the control center, as well as heart rate monitors to keep an eye on the health of the team. A drone served as their eye in the sky for tracking Diablo as he continued his bloody rampage across the island. He was spotted in a jungle clearing on the eastern side of the island, attacking a pair of long-necked Argiosaurus. He had already killed the calf and was now turning his attention to its mother. Parker and his team set out immediately. They took the jeeps as far as they could, but when the jungle became too thick, they set out on foot. That was our first mistake. We should have hunted Diablo by helicopter. I can see that now, but the winds were too high, and due to unsafe weather conditions, it was impossible to fly. I gave the team strict orders to consider their own safety above that of the animals, and to fire on anything that attacked them without hesitation. After all, there were more predators than just Chimerasaurus in these jungles, and I wasn't taking any chances. 2 hours into the hunt, things were already going wrong. A flock of Chiroptosaurus had attacked the drone, knocking it out of the air, leaving the team blind to Diablo's movements. And to make matters worse, fog was beginning to roll in, limiting their visibility even more. Our field teams and animal behaviorists had studied Chimerasaurus, and we thought we understood its hunting tactics. That was our second mistake. Due to its mixture of animal traits, its predation methods were unique, at times behaving like an ambush predator, bursting up from the water like a crocodile. More often it was observed hiding in the shadows behind the tree line of a jungle clearing, its stripes blending into the jungle like a tiger, before suddenly charging at its prey, pinning it to the ground and crushing its head or spine with its powerful jaws. By late afternoon, the hunting party came upon the clearing where Diablo had killed the calf and its mother. We hoped we would find him feeding on his latest kill, but he was gone. His tracks led deep into the jungle. The men followed. The tension was palpable back at the control center as we watched with bated breath, knowing an attack could come at any time. They followed the tracks to a large mud wallow. Like elephants and rhinos, many of the large animals on the island use these mud holes to protect their skin during the hottest parts of the day. The tracks were so jumbled due to the high traffic of the mud hole, we lost him. The trail had gone cold. The fog was growing thick and the light was failing fast. Parker and his team were about to head back to the compound for the night, and that's when it happened. All at once, the men began to feel anxious, panic-stricken, and nauseated. Their heart rate skyrocketed. Some became dizzy. Textbook effects of infrasound, low-frequency sonic vibrations beyond what humans can hear. And we realized Diablo was nearby. No one knew where he was, but they could feel his low, rumbling bellows reverberating through their bodies, causing a sense of inescapable dread. The men quickly formed a circle to cover the jungle from every direction, and then, in the gathering darkness, like some nightmare, he rose from beneath the ground. Like a Komodo dragon, he had buried himself in the mud, waiting for his next victim. The attack was ferocious and terrifying. In the chaos, we couldn't see much from the body cams, but we could hear the men's shrieks and cries of agony as the heart rate monitors flatlined one by one. 12 men went into the jungle that day. Only Nigel Parker, Clayton Marshall, and 2 others returned. As a small boy, I read countless adventure stories, tales of ancient heroes slaying dragons, or accounts of real-life hunters like James Corbett, who dealt with man-eating tigers all over India. I reenacted his jungle exploits in the forest on my father's estate where I grew up, imagining I was off on one of Corbett's adventures. But our own expedition hunting this rogue Chimerasaurus was quite different. Like most problem animals, Diablo seemed to possess an almost human level of intelligence. We set out traps and laid out bait, but he outwitted us at every turn, appearing only for a moment before disappearing again into the deepest parts of the jungle, as if he was taunting us, daring us to chase in after him. But I wasn't about to make the same mistakes. After all the losses we had suffered, I had made up my mind I wasn't going to send anyone to do what I wasn't prepared to do myself. So I insisted on joining the expedition, quite against the advice of Nigel Parker, my game warden. Diablo had no interest in the meat we had been laying out for him as bait, that much was clear, and if his aggression was not hunting behavior, that meant it must have been territorial. And so, we devised a new plan. We took 2 jeeps and 2 helicopters and set out for a jungle clearing where Diablo had been seen. We knew he would suffer no rival in his territory, so we decided to bait him with a urine sample from a young male Maxillosaurus. And once we lured him to the edge of the tree line, the plan was to fire smoke canisters laced with a powerful sedative to flush him out into the open, where we could get a clear shot at him and finally put an end to his rampage. It was all going well at first. I was in the second jeep with my game warden Nigel Parker, and the men had scented the edge of the tree line. Within 45 minutes, we could hear Diablo bellowing from deep in the jungle. He was getting steadily nearer, so we called in the helicopters that were circling in a holding pattern nearby. One of the spotters in the other jeep suddenly called in over the radio. He was here. I looked through my binoculars, and for a moment all I could see was the dappled light of the jungle canopy dancing on the leaves. But then he moved, and I suddenly realized I had been looking at him the whole time. His eyes were fixed on the jeep as he stood there camouflaged in the shadows of the trees. Our eyes met, and my blood ran cold, because I could have sworn he was staring back at me. He stepped forward, lightly bobbing his head as he scented the area, thick streams of saliva dripping from his jaws like a Komodo dragon. He scratched the ground with the large claws on his three-toed feet, and with a hiss his throat swelled with a massive intake of air. He lowered his head with his snout facing the ground like a cassowary, and let out a long, inaudible bellow we could feel in our bones. The helicopters swarmed in and fired the canisters, and as the large white plumes of smoke began to rise, Diablo became more and more agitated. It was working. We were pushing him out of the forest into the clearing. Rifles at the ready, we knew this nightmare would soon be over. Or so we thought. No sooner had he presented a clear target than the wind shifted, blowing the sedative-laced smoke back into the clearing. The updraft from the helicopter blades pulled the smoke high into the air, filling the cabin and cockpit of the chopper. The side doors of the helicopter had been left open to allow the fire team to have a clear shot at Diablo. The sedative in the smoke was designed to take down a large animal, and it was beginning to affect the pilots already. The radio chatter was frantic as one of the pilots was overcome by the smoke and lost consciousness. He veered suddenly to the left and collided with the second helicopter. Nigel Parker threw our jeep into reverse, barely escaping the flaming wreck of the two helicopters that crashed to the ground, exactly where we had been only moments before. In the chaos, no one saw where Diablo had gone. He had disappeared into the mist like a ghost. In all the excitement, I felt a sudden stabbing pain in my chest, a shortness of breath, and all at once I realized I was having a heart attack. They quickly drove me back to the medical center at the compound, and I very nearly died. But my thoughts were not for myself, but rather the poor souls in those helicopters, and how, despite our best laid plans and advanced technology, Diablo had beaten us once again. When I awoke, I found myself halfway across the world under the care of physicians at the Johns Hopkins Cardiac Center. I had undergone open heart surgery, coronary artery bypass grafting they call it. Dr. Leslie Ingram, my cardiologist, had saved my life. She insisted on complete bed rest for at least 6 weeks, and I was in no state to argue with her. But naturally I was curious about what was happening back on the island. During my absence, I learned that Nigel Parker, my game warden, had taken it upon himself to sort out this messy business with Diablo as I recovered. When I returned from the States, I read the official report, but for the sake of this recording I will allow the man who saved the island to tell you what happened in his own words.
My name is Nigel Parker. I'm the game warden for Mr. Holland here on the island. Over my career I've dealt with many problem animals, but Diablo was unlike any creature I've ever encountered before in my life. And due to the stress it was putting Mr. Holland under, I determined to have this situation dealt with by the time he got back from hospital. So I called in an old friend of mine from the army, Roy Cobb. He was a sniper who went on to do some big game hunting. So I gave him a ring and I says, Roy, I got the best hunt of your life, but you can't tell anyone about it. And, his ears perked up, and it didn't take too much to convince him to fly out to the island. Now, we'd already tried just about everything we could think of to hunt Diablo, and I knew if we went in by helicopter, we'd only scare him deeper into the jungle, so we decided to go in on foot. What most people don't understand, if you've never been out in the bush, you can't see but 2 feet in front of you at any time. So you have to be very, very careful. It's very dense, very dangerous, particularly when you're dealing with a rogue Chimerasaur. So we're making our way through the jungle. Obviously you're thinking about the big guy, Diablo, that's out there. But there's also other stuff that'll kill you in a heartbeat. I notice movement out of the corner of my eye. I take a step, something moves, I stop, it stops, and I realise that something was stalking me. So I took another step, and all of a sudden something just crashed out of the underbrush. It was a male Chickenosaur, Dagoto, as we call him. He just slammed right into me, broke my leg. I felt the claw go deep into my thigh, straight to the bone. Fortunately, he missed the femoral artery. He was aiming for my stomach, trying to kill me. But he was young and inexperienced, so it's all that saved my life, really. Roy always carries a secondary, smaller caliber rifle just for these kind of situations, so he shot the Chickenosaur, got him off me. But right after he fired his rifle, we heard this long, low, guttural bellow just echo through the trees. When you're on foot in the jungle and you hear something like that, I don't care who you are, it absolutely sends a shiver down your spine. I mean, we're dealing with a rogue apex predator here, a very powerful, dangerous animal. I'm bleeding, I've got a broken leg, we're deep, deep in his territory, and I'm injured. It's worst case scenario, really. And since I was so badly injured, we decided to circle back and follow the river to the compound. I was losing a lot of blood, and we knew that Diablo was hot on our trail the whole time. As we followed the river, we began noticing very large, very alarming tracks in the mud along the riverbank. We didn't know how fresh they were, whether they were new or old. So he could have been in front of us or behind us, we didn't know. And it was absolutely terrifying, trying to make our way back home before dark. You know, any moment this colossal beast may burst up out of the water. Because Chimerasaurs are semi-aquatic. You know, most reptiles, they need to sun themselves in order to have the energy to move. But Chimerasaurus has the opposite problem. They have trouble shedding heat. They're like big elephants, you know. They need to get in the water to cool down during the hottest part of the day. And it was incredibly hot. As we came around the bend in the river, we came up on a fresh kill, more evidence that he was nearby. And to someone who's never been around an animal carcass, there's no way to explain what the smell is like when it's been sitting there baking in the sun. It gets in your nose, it gets under your skin, you can taste it. And, we were both just keeping our eyes open, scanning the trees, scanning the water. Because if there's one animal you don't want sneaking up on you, it's Diablo, you know. I remember a flock of birds came just bursting out of the grass once, you know. In that moment, your heart just stops. Our initial plan was to use recordings of a Chimerasaur bellow to attract Diablo out of the tree line so Roy could get a clean shot at him. But the light was failing fast, so we decided it was better to try and take him out now, before it got much darker. Roy found a good spot, and, I just stayed out in this open little clearing by the river. He was in his ghillie suit, so, there were times when we were walking through the jungle, I'd turn around and I lost him. I didn't know where he was until he started moving again, so he blended in really well. Once he was in position, I hit play on the recorder, and we sent these sounds out into the jungle, and we just waited. I knew Diablo didn't like other predators in his territory, so he'd be in a bad mood when he found us. So I told Roy, don't miss. Roy had a bolt-action Macmillan Tech 50 rifle that he brought with him, really heavy beast of a gun, This thing could punch a hole through a cinder block. I showed him the diagrams of Diablo's anatomy so he'd know where to shoot, because we weren't taking any chances with this one. We didn't know how long it was going to take for Diablo to show up. I was surprised. I thought he was going to be there much, much sooner. But it was getting dark, and nightfall came. And you know, that's one of the scariest feelings in the world. When you're in the jungle and it gets so dark you can hardly see your hand in front of your face. Fortunately, the moon came out and the whole jungle changed. Everything was bathed in this eerie bluish silver light. And that's when our plan started going wrong. Because I started noticing these little pinpoints of light beyond the tree line moving through the grass. I was supposed to be bait for Diablo, but I realised that he wasn't the only one that could smell my blood. And it was like the jungle just came alive with a million eyes all glowering back at me from the dark. It was terrifying because they were starting to close in. I could hear them, all the way across the river, coming up out of the water, chirping and fighting amongst each other, It's like jackals when there's a wounded buffalo. They start nipping at each other because, they want all the best bits for themselves. And I heard them tussling through the grass. It was really unnerving. And I was so weak by that time, I knew I couldn't move to save my life. And then all of a sudden, they just stop, dead in their tracks. And the nausea sets in and I start feeling dizzy. First I thought it was because of the blood loss, but then my heart started racing and this deep primal fear sets in. And I knew what it was. It was the infrasound of Diablo's bellow. I'd felt it before at the mud wallow, just this sickening dread. And instantly all the other animals scattered. They just disappeared into the tree line. He was letting them know, this is my territory, I'm about to feed. Get out of my way. When you know an apex predator is coming your way, you can't see him, but he can see you and smell you. You feel the fear right down in your bones, this primal terror. And unless you've lived through it yourself, there's no real way to describe it. Roy, he was laying down in the grass with his ghillie suit on, and we didn't know which direction Diablo was going to come from. So for all we knew, he might step on him when he was on his way to me. Even at night, the jungle's buzzing with sound. It's deafening. All the bugs and frogs, but, all of a sudden, dead quiet. It's just this silence you could cut with a knife. And there he is, sort of just appears out of the mist, big as life, like a nightmare. You'd expect an animal as big as Diablo to make a lot of noise crashing through the underbrush. But he's not like a big movie monster. Chimerasaurs have these thick padded feet that make them virtually silent in the jungle. So Diablo starts towards me and, I'm thinking any minute now, Roy's gonna fire. He's getting closer and closer and, I'm starting to panic a bit. And then all of a sudden I hear like this click, this sickening click. The gun misfires. And I'm thinking, I've had it, I'm gonna die. But then Roy jumps up, pulls off the hood of his ghillie suit. He starts screaming like a madman, trying to draw Diablo's attention away from me. He actually started firing at him with his secondary weapon. But Diablo's muscle fibers were so thick, none of the shots were getting through. It was just making him angry. So Roy's backing up. He trips on a root coming out of the reeds, goes head over heels backwards into the long grass, and he lost his rifle. He couldn't find it because Diablo was on him. In an instant, he was after him. So all Roy could do was run for some thicker undergrowth, and he froze. He hid in his ghillie suit. Meanwhile, I'm half out of my head from blood loss, but the adrenaline kicks in because, he's trying to kill my mate. And I just saw the faintest glint of moonlight on the barrel of the gun. So I'm crawling through the mud. I get over there. I can barely lift it up. I'm seeing the tunnel, I'm about to pass out, and I cleared the breach, and I fire. I miss. I totally miss. It knocked me down. Roy saw the muzzle flash and he bolted from where he was hiding, made a beeline straight for me. And as soon as he started moving, Diablo's eyes were like snapped right on him, So he's running at me, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, drop the gun, get out of the way. He just scoops it up and wheels around and fires from the hip, and the recoil it broke his hand. And he caught Diablo square in the chest. He went sailing over both of us and just lands in a heap in the mud. So we're sitting there, I've got a busted leg, he's got a busted hand, I'm bleeding. But before we could even catch our breath, he starts moving again. He gets up, he wasn't dead. And that's when my heart just dropped into my shoes, You don't realise how powerful these animals are until you're right face to face with them. You're looking death square in the eye. When I was sitting there, when he started moving again, this thought flashed through my mind, like, who's going to feed my dog in the morning, It's like weird, bizarre things go through your mind in those moments. So Roy, his hand was just black and shaking at this point, dislocated his thumb. But he chambers another round, and he hit Diablo 2 more times, and eventually he finally went down. Now, Chimerasaurs are highly aggressive animals, but none of the others acted the way Diablo did. There was something very clearly wrong with this animal. But yeah, it was a very, very harrowing experience, but Roy saved my life that day, and I'll never forget it.
After the threat was neutralized, we brought the body back to the lab to see if we could determine the root cause of its aggressive behavior. The autopsy revealed lesions and abnormalities in his brain, which caused over-electrical stimulation of the lateral and ventral medial hypothalamus, resulting in behavioral patterns of excessive and explosive aggression. Aggressive behavior induced by stimulation of the hypothalamic region represents abnormal or pathological aggression, rather than offensive or defensive aggression you find in normal animals. To make matters worse, these hypothalamically induced attacks were completely unpredictable, targeting males, females, and even the young of every species on the island. No one was safe. As relieved as we were that Diablo was finally gone, we soon realized our problems weren't over yet. One of our field research teams discovered a nest deep in Diablo's original territory. His mate had laid a fresh clutch of eggs, and based on the condition of the nest, they would be hatching soon. Crocodile DNA was one of the many building blocks that went into Chimerasaurus' unique biological makeup. The number of eggs crocodilians lay varies from species to species. The West African dwarf crocodile lays about 10, while the largest species, the saltwater crocodile, lays between 40 to 60. Chimerasaurus lays 33 to 66 eggs. The fate of everything I had built was at stake. After all, one problem Chimerasaur nearly destroyed the entire ecosystem of the island. And since Diablo was the father, the risk of his genetic defect being passed on to his young was too high. Something had to be done about those eggs. Like crocodiles, female Chimerasaurs only leave their nests for a short time to cool their bodies in nearby lakes or mangrove swamps. And so, as the big female who the researchers had named Lilith left her nest unattended, a small team led by James Irwin, my head animal wrangler, destroyed the eggs, and the nightmare was finally over. It took a full year for the population of the island to stabilize, as the various animal groups slowly reclaimed their natural territorial boundaries. I have often wondered at nature's ability to recover from catastrophic events. While I wanted these creatures to live as naturally as possible, Nigel Parker suggested we tag all of the animals on the island as a precautionary measure so we could track their movements and behavior to ensure the devastation we saw with Diablo would never happen again. I begrudgingly agreed, and we set up a full-time monitoring station where animal behaviorists, veterinary technicians, and various other researchers kept a watchful eye over our tropical paradise. We purposely allowed new life to reclaim the island before attempting to introduce a new Chimerasaurus. And for a time, Lilith was the only member of her species that roamed the jungle. After everything that happened with Diablo, naturally we were extremely cautious about releasing another Chimerasaur. But for all my fears and apprehension, deep down I knew this island needed an apex predator to maintain balance, if this Neozoic ecosystem would one day survive without the aid of human interference. And so we began growing a new clutch of Chimerasaurus eggs in the lab, checking and double-checking our genetic template, scanning for any potentially harmful defects at every stage of development. We instituted a mandatory MRI and CT scan for every new animal born on the island to check for brain lesions or other abnormalities, particularly in the hypothalamic region, before we released them into the general population. Despite my initial apprehension, I couldn't deny my growing excitement. It had now been well over a year since the disaster we had had with Diablo, and I felt this island was ready for its new king. When I saw him hatch, he was unlike the others. Instead of the bold tiger stripe markings we had so meticulously designed, he was black from nose to tail, with bright amber eyes that shined like gold against his dark, pebbled skin. Some leopards appear completely black due to a recessive gene mutation called melanism. They're commonly known as black panthers, and he was born with this same genetic trait. So we named him Erebus, after the personification of darkness in Greek mythology. He was unique among his brothers and sisters as they emerged from the nest one by one. And I knew he would inherit this island as his kingdom and rule it long after I was gone. When I returned briefly to the States to get my affairs in order, I hadn't realized how accustomed I had grown to life on the island. It was our own private community. We saw the same people every day, and by contrast the noise and bustle of the city was overwhelming. I was used to the open air, the smell of tropical fruits and plants, and rich, clean earth. But here the air was stale and filthy. I used to love the city, but now it felt claustrophobic, like a prison. I had no one to pass my oil company to. My dear wife, Elaine, had passed away 15 years prior, and we never had any children. So I restructured the company so all of my earnings would go towards the maintenance of the island. I liquidated the rest of my personal assets and turned them into bonuses for everyone who worked on the Neozoic Project, from the highest levels down to the maintenance workers. Set them up for life as a thank you for making my dream a reality. I decided to move back and spend my remaining years on the island, surrounded by the creatures that we made and the people who made them, people who I had grown to see as my family. All the top minds in their fields, our lead genetic researchers, Doctors Ian McNeil and Renee Cromwell, head of computer science is Jerry Newman, our lead embryologist Brianna Long, who was a rising star in her field, veteran animal behaviorists Alan and Sarah Henderson, my game warden Nigel Parker, security chief Clayton Marshall, head animal wrangler James Irwin, and finally maintenance chief Charles J. O'Brien. As I near the end of my life, I can go to my final reward with the satisfaction of knowing we have finally achieved my dream. In a world overrun with technology and advancement, here the past has returned. On this island, fleet-footed Struthiosaurus use their speed to escape large predators, while at the water's edge, a herd of long-necked Archosaurus and three-horned Tricornusaurs put aside their rivalry to quench their thirst, as a family of duck-billed Anatisaurus climb up the muddy banks to forage for vegetation. Deep in the jungle, sailback Zegosaurus defends its kill against a swarming group of greedy Primisaurus. While high over the jungle canopy, winged Chiroptosaurs rule the air. As the sounds of all manner of jungle life and insects echo through the forest, the slender Ephemeraptor uses its signature sickle claw to pin down snakes and eels, while in the shadows, moving silently across the jungle floor, the deadly dagger-toed Chickenosaurus stalks its prey. In this primal ecosystem, the island's apex predators Maxillosaurus and Chimerasaurus Rex battle for supremacy in a struggle that will continue long after I am gone. Apart from their obvious visual similarities, I knew we could never truly call them dinosaurs, so we decided to classify them as Neosaurs instead. This place was the culmination of my life's work and ambition, because long ago, when the world was young and wild, the earth was covered in lush teeming jungles, untamed, savage and beautiful. Before history, before memory, this land was ruled by giants. Giants whose footsteps shook the earth, whose roars split the air, echoing through the trees like thunder. Their dominion stretched from damp marshlands and swamps to mountaintops and beyond, soaring through the clouds, to grasslands and jungle clearings where predator and prey lived side by side in an endless fight for survival. But as they passed silently into history, a new world arose, a world of progress built on their bones, where their strength and savagery is only remembered in our great halls of science on display for the curious. But here, on this Neozoic Island, in a distant corner of the world, they rule once again.